Good morning and welcome to Dale Street Evangelical Church Online. Thank you for joining us this morning for the next devotional in our new series. We started last week. James Butterfield brought to us the first in the series, The Shocking Servant. He actually started with the last three verses of chapter 52, and this week we're going to start with the first three verses of chapter 53, The Misunderstood Messiah. Just to recap on a couple of things that James said last week, if you have missed last week's, Isaiah is a book of prophecy, which is to predict something that will happen in the future. I read in one commentary, a gentleman called Adam Clark, that says this about Isaiah 53. This chapter foretells the sufferings of the Messiah, the end for which he was to die, and the advantages resulting to mankind from that illustrious event. This chapter contains a beautiful summary of the most peculiar and distinguishing doctrines of Christianity. I couldn't agree with that statement more myself. I think for me, this chapter in the Bible, in Isaiah, surrounding the circumstances of Jesus' death, goes into really, really great detail, probably more so than anywhere else in the Bible. So considering that this book was written approximately 800 years before the Messiah was even born, I find that pretty amazing. Now, as James mentioned last week, quite often prophetic texts are written in the form of poems or referenced with music or written in the style of a song. And chapter 53 it is one of those kind of texts, and it can be broken down into short segments. This week, like I said, we want to start with the first three verses of Isaiah 53. It says this: Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain, like one from whom people hid their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Just three short verses and a few quick thoughts for us this morning. Firstly, verse 1. Whom has believed our message? Prophetically, Isaiah anticipates two things in this opening verse. Firstly, he anticipates how strange and contradictory it seems that this suffering Messiah, who we heard about last week, who was beaten and deformed so much that he wasn't even recognisable as a man, at the same time represents salvation and cleansing to the nations. Secondly, he anticipates the rejection of this misunderstood Messiah, and that many would not believe him. It goes on to say, to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? In the context of the Messiah's suffering and agony that he'd endure on the cross, that line can kind of seem out of place. The arm of the Lord is a picture of his strength, his power and his might, and yet we see a Messiah weak and suffering. When the people of Jesus' time saw him hanging on the cross, they mocked him and they laughed and they spat at him. And James spoke about that last week. And you see the Messiah here on the cross greatly misunderstood. People didn't understand the significance of what was happening. But in the midst of the suffering, seemingly this weak Messiah, God would express his strength and his power and his might. Verse 2 goes on, it says this: He grew up before him like a tender shoot and like a root out of dry ground. Now, I guess I might be a person who people might refer to as a bit of a sado. My idea of a cracking Friday night is sitting down with a cup of tea, a packet of biscuits, and a good episode of Gardener's World. I don't claim to be any form of Monty Don, but I am proud of my little garden. We've been in this house for 5 years, and when we first moved in, the garden was just a blank, bare space. It was block paved, there was no grass, the borders were just dry, hard soil, and not much growing in it. And Caroline and I spent quite a lot of time working the soil, adding fertiliser and mulch and manure and all the other things that you put into soil to improve it. And with a little bit of time and with a bit of care, signs of new growth began to appear. And like I said, I'm no Monty Don, but we now have a lovely garden that's full of colour and life. And I don't possess any great power, strength or might. So I ask myself the question, why do we often doubt God's ability to do what seems to be impossible? Jesus grew up in the Galilee region of Roman-occupied Palestine, and in respect to spiritual matters and political matters and the standard of living kind of matters in that area, you could say that area was very much indeed dry ground. But God placed his son, the Messiah, into that dry soil, if you like. And God can bring the most wonderful things out of dry ground. And there's a challenge in there for you and for I, if you're a Christian, next time that you see what looks like dry ground, try and look at it in the way that God does and see it as hopeful soil. It goes on to say, he had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. When I read that verse, it really hit me, because I guess so often we see images of Jesus in movies, in books, and he's depicted as this kind of figure with a chiseled jawline, long flowing locks of shiny hair. And the Bible tells us that in terms of his physical appearance, the Messiah wasn't any different to the average man. There was nothing particularly special about his appearance that made him stand out and that made him noticeable. Nothing that would really draw attention to him physically. The religious leaders of the day, they would have known the scriptures well, and they were anticipating the arrival of this Messiah, but they totally missed it because they were looking at material things. Jesus was born to a father, Joseph, who was just a mere carpenter, and a meek and humble Virgin Mary as a mother. It's not the kind of setting that the religious leaders of the time would have been looking for. The Messiah was grossly misunderstood, and eventually those leaders would manipulate the arrest of Jesus, which would lead to his eventual death. The Bible tells us that the Messiah was not a man of remarkable physical beauty. And how often do we try and make the gospel look beautiful? And when I thought about that, I know that I can sometimes be guilty of trying to pretty things up. For instance, if I'm at work and I'm talking to colleagues and I'm questioned about my faith, I'm always conscious of what they might think if I give them the kind of full throttle gospel message. So I'm often guilty of drip feeding the bits that I think are going to sound okay, and I'm bothered about what people are going to think, and I'm bothered about how it's going to come across. And I've been really challenged this week as I've read these verses to consider the way that I do that. And in future, it's been a challenge to me not to attempt to make things sound nicey, because in doing that I might actually be taking away from the real message and enabling the Messiah Jesus to actually be misunderstood. The fact is that we're encouraged to share the gospel message in its entirety. And it's not our job to try and make it sound beautiful. And in reality, it's the Holy Spirit's job to work the beauty of it into people's hearts and into people's minds. So I hope that's a challenge for you, as it has been for me. Finally, the verse 3 says, he was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. I think this is often one of the most misunderstood things about Jesus, that often we see Jesus as this kind of jovial, happy, smiley character. And don't get me wrong, there's times where we're reading the scriptures where Jesus expresses joy, but we have a tendency sometimes to kind of glamorise the physical aspects of the cross. And obviously they are really important, and they're an important part of the story, but something much deeper is going on when Jesus is bowing in the Garden of Gethsemane and he's saying, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass from me. We're told that Jesus was a man who experienced great pain and grief, a man who was misunderstood, despised and rejected. And maybe you've been hearing the gospel message for some time, but you've been misunderstanding the significance of the Messiah. And it really will be my prayer that over the coming weeks, as we dig a little bit deeper into the character and the real beauty of Jesus, might be revealed to you. Thank you for listening this morning, and I look forward to hopefully seeing you all at church very soon. It's been far too long, but we look forward to getting back together as soon as it's safe to do so. Take care and God bless.